At dawn, the water on Lake Crescent lay varnished smooth, a pane of dark blue glass pressed into the gorge of the Olympic Mountains. The fisherman launched alone from the public ramp at Fairholme, easing the aluminum skiff off the trailer with the practiced economy of someone who'd done it too many mornings to count. His name was Trevor Hale, 38, forklift operator in Port Angeles, winter steelhead on the Elwha, summer kokanee on Crescent, always the same battered thermos of coffee riding the bow. He fished not for crowds or records, but to listen. Out here, he felt the quiet peel back layer by layer until it became a sort of honesty. He motored west 100 yards, killed the engine, and let the skiff drift. The sonar unit, a mid-range consumer model, wired to the battery in a milk crate, sighed to life, painting the bottom in a pixel ribbon that crawled from right to left. Hale watched the screen the way other people watch the sky. Lake Crescent held its secrets tight. 200 meters at its deepest, sheer-walled and freakishly clear, it hoarded cold the way some men hoard grudges. Locals like to say the lake never gave back what it took. Some called that a legend. Others, a warning. He worked the downrigger to 50 feet and let the spoon wander. The sonar drew the slope, a quick plunge to 80, a terrace of jumble rock and drowned trunks, then a clean fall into the dark. He sipped coffee, drifted, adjusted. The screen showed baked clouds like smudges and trout as neat arches rising to look, falling to shrug. Then, between arches, a geometry that didn't fit. A rectangle standing proud of the bottom, 8 feet long, 3 wide, 2 high, casting a shadow where it should not. Hale frowned and nudged the boat back across the same line. The rectangle painted again, a cage shape, cross members, straight angles nature avoids. He stared longer than he meant to. The spoon wobbled unnoticed. On his third pass, the sonar flashed a second return a dozen yards downslope from the first. Not a rectangle, but a lopsided mound strewn with voids and reflections, like a cluster of stones broken and piled. Except the sonar drew no stone, no density consistent with granite, no clean echo. The mound looked, inexplicably, like a loose heap of what? He zoomed the unit in until the pixels went chunky. At 7:26, he marked the points. At 7:31, he called in a possible hazard to navigation to the National Park Service dispatch line, which accepted such calls with patient neutrality. Downed trees, lost paddles, the lake's occasional drift net of weeds clutching an outboard prop. The dispatcher logged his GPS numbers, thanked him, and said a ranger boat would check it when available. He hung up, then hovered, unsettled without a word to give the feeling. A minute, 5, 10. He told himself it was nothing and told himself again. He made one more pass, snapped a photo of the sonar screen, and then, for the first time since he'd begun fishing alone, he put on his life jacket and cinched it hard. By mid-morning, the wind came up and chopped the surface into pewter scales. Hale trailered out, drove into Port Angeles, and went to work. At lunch, he took out his phone, looked at the photo of the screen, and felt the same cold tick behind his eyes. The rectangle looked like a crate built by someone who had studied how to make a thing sink. 2 days later, a Park Service patrol skiff ran Hale's coordinates. The ranger at the helm, a former Coast Guard bosun named Albright, dropped a tethered camera into the lake. The top 20 feet of water was Olympic clear. Beyond that, the blue turned midnight and swallowed the camera light into a tunnel of particulates. At 60 feet, the lens found the rectangle. It was a stainless steel cage with welded mesh sides and a hinged lid wired shut, resting upright on the slope. A colonnade of air bubbles clung along the mesh where algae could not. Albright radioed his supervisor, swung the skiff upwind, and reset for a look at the second target. The camera descended into a flicker of bone. Not one skeleton, but many, long bones and ribs and vertebrae tangled among torn cloth and plastic. The operator stopped breathing. The camera drifted, cables taut and humming. Albright swallowed, thumbed the transmit key, and said the thing you never want to say on a casual patrol. We have remains. Send everyone. By noon, the lake held 3 boats. The Park Patrol, the Clallam County Sheriff's Office Marine Unit, and the Olympic National Park Dive Team towing a yellow remotely operated vehicle on a thick umbilical. The ROV pilot said as little as possible. The camera nosedived and steadied. On screen, the stainless cage sat like a prop from a bad dream. The ROV's manipulator pressed the wire of the lid. Closed tight. Beyond, the slope fell into a field of pale ovals entangled in netting that had mostly rotted away. 2 skulls lay cheek to shoulder, mouths round, eye sockets black as the lake. They filmed for an hour, then pulled the robot and backswept water off the deck with squeegees. A detective from the sheriff's office conferred with the park chief and a prosecutor on speakerphone. The decision, never easy, never cheap, was to treat the site as a mass fatality crime scene. They would not raise anything that day. They would grid the slope in software, build a plan, and bring in a forensics coordinator who had once worked a plane wreck in Idaho and returned with every bone anyone could name. News did not break, it seeped. A fisherman had found submerged debris. Rangers were assessing. The words were true and useless. Hale told no one at work what he had seen on the camera. He ate microwave pizza at the break table and kept his hands flat against the paper plate because they wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning brought divers in dry suits, a portable barge with a hydraulic davit, the ROV again, and a tent city at the Fairholme lot. The lake gave them perfect weather and the kind of visibility that fooled newcomers into thinking all lakes might be so generous. The divers went down in pairs, clipped to downlines, and worked blind when silt went up. Within the first hour, they lifted a single human femur in a mesh evidence bag, and with it a piece of orange nylon strap cut clean through. Before noon, they had wrestled a duffel up that held nothing anyone planned for. 2 bricks of concrete, a roll of plastic sheeting, and 20 pounds of rusted chain. At the press podium, the sheriff refused to guess. He used phrases you keep for when the camera lights are hot and survivors are watching. Dignity of the deceased, methodical approach. We urge patience. Behind him, the Olympic peaks wore a ring of cloud like a veil. To one side, an elderly woman held a photograph of a young man in a hiking hat and stared past everything. When the cage came up on day 3, every boat on the lake drifted to still. The davit strained and sang. The stainless box breached, streaming lake water, and for a breath it looked like a thing built to cleanly contain badness. They set it on tarps and cut the wires and opened the lid and saw why someone had wired it shut. Inside lay a human body in near-perfect preservation. Not skeleton, not mummy, but a figure softened by water and kept from oxygen long enough to resist decay. The face was waxen, the skin pale and taut. The jaw hung at a wrong angle. A nylon strap circled the neck once, then twice. The medical examiner on scene whispered an apology to a person who was no longer there. They zipped the bag and carried it up the dock. The county activated a family assistance protocol. A toll-free number went live. The sheriff's office established a secure upload link for people to submit missing persons files, dental charts, DNA swabs. The uploads came from Port Angeles and Forks, then Tacoma and Seattle, then Idaho, Oregon. Further, names going back years, a decade, in some cases two. Lake Crescent had its own infamous Lady of the Lake, a woman whose body had surfaced in the 1940s, preserved like soap by the cold depths, identified eventually as Hallie Illingworth and tied to a domestic murder. Locals knew that story like a family scar, touching it in conversation to remind themselves scars could heal. But this was not one woman. This was a cemetery. The forensic operation settled into the tempo investigators hoped for and dread. They recovered 3 more cages over the week, each containing a single body preserved by the depth and isolation, each with the same nylon strap around the neck. Between the cages, they collected bones enough to suggest at least 13 more individuals in various states of disarticulation. Preliminary lab work found fibers of identical orange nylon on multiple remains. Sections of plastic sheeting carried the imprint of a particular brand sold in bulk at regional hardware chains. Zip ties bore tool marks from the same model of hand crimper. Someone had done this again and again with method, budget, and time. The park's superintendent issued a statement that quoted a line from a Clallam legend about Storm King, the mountain that looms east of the lake. The elders said that once, long ago, Storm King grew angry at the tribe's quarrels and hurled a landslide that dammed the river, birthing Lake Crescent and Lake Sutherland. The water, the story went, was his way of making people listen. The superintendent did not say whether Storm King had grown angry again, but reporters read the line as metaphor and the internet did the rest. The task force sat in a windowless room at the Port Angeles courthouse with the dry erase board everyone hates. What are our patterns? The initial lists were unhelpful because most murders start that way. Approximate year of death, ranging from early 2000s to last summer. Gender, mixed. Age, 20s to 50s. Nationality, unknown in many, mixed in identified cases. Traveler status, many out-of-towners, some locals with tenuous ties to the lake. When the crime scene unit overlaid recovered IDs, dental matches, and personal items, a ring etched with initials, a hiking stove with a scratch serial. A shape at last took form, not with the bodies, but with where those bodies had been the night before they disappeared. 7 of the identified victims had checked into the same lodging within 2 days of their last known contact. A privately owned waterfront inn on the north shore of the lake, a few miles east of Fairholme, called Storm King Lodge. The name was old, the building older. The property website showed timber posts, a porch with rocking chairs, a private dock. Reviews were a mix of polite and peculiar. Perfectly quiet / almost too quiet. Check in after sunset only. No children. Odd smell in the stairwell. Maybe the lake. One reviewer mentioned a staff lake ceremony on foggy nights. Another noted that the lodge discouraged guests from asking about local drownings. The detective who found the 7th overlap did not exclaim. He quietly circled the lodge on the board, then circled the dates. They came in clusters, not every summer, not even every year, but in pulses bracketed by late August new moons. The investigator wrote 2 words beneath the map, calendar logic. The task force drafted subpoenas and then a warrant. They drove to the lodge as a line of mist seeped in from the water and hung like lace along the cedars. Storm King Lodge had no vacancy sign and no one at the desk, but a bell with a note that said press for staff. They pressed. After a minute, an older man with careful hair and a wool vest came through a side door and smiled in a way that read as both professional and patient. He introduced himself as Eldon Marr, manager. When they showed him the warrant, he turned the smile off, but did not argue. He asked if they wanted coffee. The lead detective said no. The public rooms had the curated rustic of a place that sold people on a fantasy: stone fireplace, leather chairs, a framed photograph of a 1920s regatta. The private corridors smelled like any old hotel: dust, linen, something chemical. In the office safe, they found guest ledgers going back 15 years, redundant with the digital records they would also seize. In a locked cabinet, they found a shallow drawer of brass keys with fobs engraved with the lodge logo. On the back wall hung a carved cedar plaque depicting a crowned mountain over a lake. In neat script beneath, Storm King keeps what is given. In the basement, they found the door. It was beveled oak reinforced on the inside with a steel plate, painted to match the trim and camouflaged by a rolling shelf. It opened into a hallway whose cinder block walls had been painted a pastoral green. The hall widened into a low room that smelled of dried kelp and melted candle wax. What the first flashlight beam found there made 3 of the 5 investigators stop in the doorway because their bodies did it before their minds. A circle of knee-high cedar stools arranged facing a shallow poured concrete trough the size of a canoe, stained dark by 100 poured libations. On the walls hung photographs of the lake at night, each framed by a ring of tiny mirrors. On a side table, stacked placards laser-etched with a symbol, a crown over a wave. The trough's bottom held a few inches of water and something else, frayed ends of orange nylon strap, and 3 polished river stones stacked in a cairn. The evidence tech whispered, "What is this?" And the manager, who had come as far as the threshold and no farther, said, "A devotional space, calm as an usher offering programs." He called the group who met there the Choir of Storm King, a phrase he offered with zero embarrassment and zero pride. "It is not illegal to pray," he said. They read him his rights then and there. He asked for an attorney. Without him to narrate, the room narrated itself. On a shelf lay binders stamped with the lodge crest, each containing dozens of pages, names of bodies of water, dates of moon phases, handwritten notes, and clipped news articles about drownings and disappearances on lakes across the Northwest. In pockets were brochures for private cruises the lodge had once offered, moonwater evenings, and so many thin white candles it turned number into threat. The deputies followed a second corridor to a locked steel door. The bolt looked new. Inside stood a workroom with stainless tables and heavy-duty plastic sheeting and rolls. There were cables, crimpers, spools of galvanized wire, shrink wrap, chain. There were 2 disassembled steel cages leaning against the wall. There were 6 orange nylon straps still threaded through metal cam buckles. And there was a calendar on a nail with 3 dates circled in red: August 28th, September 1st, September 3rd, the nights of the new moon and the 2 following. The task force went upstairs and took the guest records first, then the lodge computers, then every paper that said weather, moon, or water. They sealed the devotional room and the workroom and the office safe and the dock shed, where 2 more stainless cage lids stood against a wall, spray-etched with the lodge emblem in a moment of pride someone else in the organization had counseled against as needlessly incriminating. By the end of the week, a story with edges began to show. Storm King Lodge is a business that made money from tourists and something else from the people who ran it. A choir as a social club with liturgy and dues, and downhill of that, the darker circle only some passed into. The legend of Storm King, the mountain whose anger made a lake, functioned here as a theology of exchange. In lodge materials that read like sermons but used the grammar of brochures, the lake was an altar, the night a veil, the offering a return. They never wrote victim. They wrote gift. The manager's attorney arranged a statement in which his client disavowed any criminal misuse of the devotional space. He said the room was historical, that the cages were movie props from a local production years ago, and the straps were cargo supplies for dock maintenance. He said the lodge had performed symbolic rites in which candlelight was floated onto the lake, but only with permits. He called the mass grave in the deep water a catastrophic coincidence. The sheriff did not call it any such thing. Search warrants multiplied. So did affidavits. The more they dug, The more the missing overlapped the ledgers. Guests with one-night stays under names that later proved false. Walk-ins on storm nights who paid in cash and gave cell numbers that led nowhere. Among the staff, some had long tenures. One woman had worked nights at the desk for 22 years and remembered every one of them. She said she had no knowledge of any crimes. When shown the devotional room, she looked at her shoes and said she had never been in the basement. Asked about the dock, she said she never went out there because the lake takes things. Asked who in management supervised basement access, she said the owners did, and that the owners were Eldon Marr and his wife Vera, and their son Caleb, who lived off-site and sometimes helped with maintenance. The affidavit for Caleb's house in Port Angeles read like an inventory of plausible deniability until a detective opened a hall closet and found a zipped canvas gear bag that smelled of lake water and bleach. Inside lay a dive hood, a pair of neoprene gloves, an underwater scooter still shedding flakes of dried silt, and a notebook in a plastic sleeve. The notebook listed dates. The dates matched lodge ledger entries and moon phases. Next to September 3rd, the day a fisherman named Hale marked 2 points on a sonar screen. Someone had written, "Left too long. Retrieve." When they went to arrest Caleb, he wasn't home. When they went to the lodge to take Eldon and Vera into custody, the front door stood open and the bell sat on the counter and no one pressed it. They cleared the building room by room. The kitchen lights glowed. The coffee urn gurgled. The staff lot held no one's car. On the dock, a single candle burned at noon so faintly it looked like a fly landing on glass. They found Eldon and Vera 2 miles east in a rented storage unit where the floor sloped to a drain and a hose lay coiled. The workbench bore a line of polished stones. Eldon had written a note. Vera had not. The note contained no apology and no map, just 6 words. "We kept what the water wanted." It was the line reporters used for a week because it was monstrous and because it had cadence. After that, the line soured and people stopped saying it out loud. The prosecutor announced charges, multiple counts of murder and conspiracy for Eldon and Vera, plus accessory counts for anyone who could be shown to have materially aided the acts. Caleb remained at large. The devotional room photographs hit the papers, then TV, then the kind of true crime forums that reverse engineer both villains and heroes from pixels. A cottage industry bloomed around the lake's old legends. The Quinault and Clallam elders gave careful statements reminding everyone that stories predated the lodge by a century and belonged to communities, not to crimes. A few Seattle columnists wrote about the hunger of cities to project their nightmares onto rural places, especially when those places were ringed by peaks and fog. Divers returned to the lake. ROV operators widened the grid. They found, in water black and blue enough to make a camera lie about distance, 2 more cages and a scatter of bones outside their plan. Beyond the slope they had named and mapped, the bottom fell away into no plan at all. A senior diver, turning at depth to inhale against the throb of his own blood in his ears, signaled up. When he surfaced, he declared, with professional restraint, that the known grave site might not be the only one. At the courthouse, the judge denied bail. Eldon sat still and met no one's eyes. Vera wept without sound. The prosecutors said the case would be complex, the forensics time-consuming, the charging decisions staged as identifications solidified. A reporter asked whether this was a cult. The prosecutor said, "A criminal enterprise with ritualized trappings," a phrase that satisfied no one and yet fit. A second reporter asked how long it had gone on. The prosecutor said, "We believe at least 15 years, and did not say the thing everyone thought, that if you follow a habit long enough, you will confuse it with a rule, then with a law, then with worship." Trevor Hale gave his statement and went back to work. He stopped fishing for a while and then, one still morning, launched alone again because the skiff felt like a part of him and the quiet, despite everything, still held. He stayed far from the grid and drooped his spoon in the shadow of a cliff. The sonar drew the clean parabolic arc of trout rising and the sharp drop of rock. He breathed in time with the screen. When his coffee was gone, he hauled in, motored slow back to the ramp, and told no one about the way the lake sometimes sounded like a long exhale, like a room finally emptying of people. Caleb Marr's face appeared on screens before most locals even knew his name. The sheriff's office released two photographs, a driver's license shot where he stared straight ahead with a neutral jaw, and a candid from a lodge staff picnic. Sunglasses pushed to his head, eyes pinched against the sun, half-smile caught in motion. Below each was the same notice. Wanted for questioning. Considered a flight risk. The news cycle gave him 48 hours before his image began its slow migration to the online rumor mills, where strangers redrew his life into what they needed it to be: a master manipulator, a mindless follower, the true leader of the cult, or just a man born into something too deep to wade out of. The real Caleb, according to court records, had lived most of his 34 years between Port Angeles and the north shore of Lake Crescent. He'd attended community college, worked construction, done seasonal maintenance at the lodge, and been cited twice for fishing without a license. No felonies, no violence, no clear motive. Yet his notebooks and gear bag were more damning than any confession could have been. The task force traced his last verified sighting to the day Eldon and Vera were arrested. A neighbor on West 14th Street saw him load a duffel into the back of a dark green pickup and drive west toward Highway 101. The same truck turned up 3 hours later on a trailhead camera at Barnes Point. The Rangers swept every trail, cove, and pullout between the lodge and the Lyre River outlet. No Caleb. The cult story. Inside the courthouse evidence room, detectives laid out what they'd learned about the Choir of Storm King. The earliest surviving materials dated to 1989, before the Marr family even owned the lodge. These were typewritten pages on lodge letterhead, referencing seasonal observances tied to moonless nights when the lake accepts her due. It wasn't until the early 2000s, after Eldon inherited the property from a childless uncle, that the language grew darker, the rites more structured. The theology was scavenged from the local Clallam and Quinault legend of Storm King, how the mountain's wrath dammed the valley and created Lake Crescent, but warped until the lake itself became a conscious entity, a keeper that demanded offerings. In their sermons, the offerings weren't symbolic. They were complete returns of travelers whose lives were to be folded into the depth. On one photocopied sermon dated August 2009, Eldon's handwriting ran down the margin. "We keep what is given. We give what is kept." The core members, never more than a dozen, believed that the lake watched them, and that by feeding it, they kept its waters clear and benevolent. In practice, that meant finding outsiders, hikers, kayakers, and solo travelers who checked in at the lodge. Sometimes they targeted drifters or people estranged from their families, but not always. Their pattern was unpredictable enough to make connections slow to surface. Those selected were lured to the dock under some pretext, a moonlit blessing, a private ceremony included with the stay. Once there, the victim was restrained, strangled, and placed in a cage weighted with concrete and chain. The cage was towed behind a lodge skiff to a deep drop-off mapped decades earlier by the cult's founders. The act was done without witnesses outside the core group, and any staff not in the inner circle saw nothing but the guests checking out early. The missing years. In interviews, a few former employees admitted that strange things happened at the lodge: unregistered guests, storage rooms that were locked one day and empty the next, but they'd either been too afraid to ask questions or too certain no one would believe them. One woman, hired in 2012 as a housekeeper, described hearing splashing from the dock long after midnight and seeing candlelight moving out on the water. She'd quit 2 weeks later. As forensic divers continued their work, they recovered more than just human remains. They found rusted propane canisters, ceramic mugs with the lodge crest, a weathered camera with a shattered lens, and a nearly intact backpack still zipped, containing a wallet and a driver's license from British Columbia. The license photo matched a missing persons report from 2016, a solo cyclist en route to Seattle, last seen in Port Angeles. His family had never stopped searching. By midwinter, the official victim count reached 22 confirmed individuals, with the medical examiner's office warning that the number could grow. At least 6 were foreign nationals, 5 were from other U.S. states. The earliest estimated death was in 2004. The most recent? Possibly August of the year Hale made his sonar call. Caleb's Trail. In February, a backcountry skier spotted a green pickup half buried in snow at the end of a Forest Service spur road north of Crescent Ridge. The plates matched Caleb's truck. Inside were camping gear, a propane heater, and an empty plastic case for a spear gun. There were no signs of a struggle. Searchers cut a swath through the snow and found boot prints heading west toward a series of cliff bands overlooking the lake. The prints ended abruptly at the lip of a drop-off. No body, no rope, no gear below. Just frozen scree and the hiss of wind through furs. Some in the task force believed he'd jumped. Others thought he'd staged his own disappearance, maybe with help. One detective pointed out that if Caleb wanted to vanish, he couldn't have picked a better place than the Olympic backcountry. Miles of untracked forest, whether that erased trails and hours, and a lake deep enough to take anything. The house by the tracks. In March, investigators served a final warrant on a small house Eldon kept in the town of Joyce, used, according to property records, as a maintenance residence. It looked abandoned from the outside, blinds drawn, siding grayed with salt wind. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of mildew. In the basement, they found something none of them expected: 3 more bodies. These were not caged or submerged. They lay in shallow trenches in the dirt floor, wrapped in canvas tarps, faces covered with cloth. Each bore the same orange nylon strap around the neck. The coroner estimated they'd been dead less than a year. They weren't locals. No IDs. No signs of defensive wounds. Whoever killed them had done so quietly, away from the water. But the house held something else: a small writing desk, and in its top drawer, a sealed envelope marked in block letters: Caleb. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Eldon's handwriting tight and slanted. If you cannot carry it on, leave it in the lake. Do not let them take it from us. It is not theirs to have. The hanging. 6 weeks later, a hiker in the Elwha Valley stumbled across a body suspended from a cedar limb 20 feet above the ground. It took a climbing team to bring him down. The face was bloated, the features distorted, but fingerprints confirmed it: Caleb Marr. He'd been dead for days. A nylon strap, not orange but plain black, was knotted around his neck. In his right hand was a folded piece of paper, water-stained but legible. The lake is not done. No one could say whether it was confession, prophecy, or warning. Open water. By summer, the lodge was boarded up, its dock roped off, its website scrubbed from the internet. Eldon and Vera awaited trial, refusing plea deals. The prosecution built its case body by body, ledger by ledger, moon phase by moon phase. The divers kept going back. The slope where Hale had found the first cage was mapped down to the inch, yet the ROV kept glimpsing anomalies beyond the grid. shapes that could be boulders, could be logs, could be something else. Each time they moved to investigate, the light seemed to fall short, as though the water swallowed more than it should. Trevor Hale fished less often, but sometimes, when the morning was clear and the lake looked like a mirror, he'd launch just to drift and listen. The shoreline was the same as it had always been: cedar shadows, gulls over the shallows, the dark shape of Storm King Mountain guarding the east. And in that stillness, he sometimes thought he heard it again, the long, low exhale from beneath, like something patient and vast reminding him it was there.